Hello, I'm Abby Phillip, and welcome to our special coverage of the hush money trial of Donald Trump, streaming on CNN Max. Well, so much for a dry trial about paperwork. Things got really heated today when the prosecution called one of the biggest witnesses we've been expecting, adult film actress Stormy Daniels, to the stand today. Her allegations of a sexual encounter with Donald Trump in 2006 and the subsequent attempts to reportedly pay her to keep her quiet are at the heart of this case. Now, amid a slew of objections from Trump's attorneys, Daniels outlined her alleged sexual encounter with the then businessman in 2006. While most of the private details of her testimony were banned before she even started, Daniels' testimony did push Trump's defense team to ultimately ask for a mistrial. Judge Duane St then denied that, but said that he would issue limiting instructions for the jury as they deliberate over what she had to say. Now, Daniels then talked about the events that led to her trying to accept payment to keep her story quiet, and the reporting that instead made the story very much public. Under cross-examination, Daniels was pressed about calling Trump names, her personal hatred of the former president, and those outstanding attorney's fees that she does owe him and yet refuses to pay. A defense attorney accused Daniels several times of making up details of her story, which she, of course, strongly denied. So there is so much to discuss, and I have experts on standby to help me break everything down. But first, CNN's Kara Scannell was inside the courtroom yet again, and she has all the details about what occurred today.
On the stand, Stormy Daniels, the former adult film star and director at the center of the first criminal trial of Donald J. Trump. The $130,000 deal in exchange for her silence is at the heart of the prosecution's case.
Is this true? Can you sleep with Stormy?
On Tuesday, prosecutors tried to paint Daniels as a credible witness, having her reveal specific details on her alleged sexual encounter with Trump and the events surrounding it. Trump denies the affair. Meanwhile, during cross-examination, Trump's attorneys tried to undercut Daniels' testimony by attacking her motivations, credibility, and demonstrating how much she hates Trump. Daniels testified she met Trump while working at a celebrity golf tournament in 2006. That's when Trump invited her to dinner. Later, in Trump's penthouse suite, she said they talked for 2 hours and Trump asked thoughtful business questions. She explained she went to the bathroom and when I exited, he was just up on the bed like this, in boxers and a t-shirt, she said while demonstrating his pose for the jury. She noted it was not in a threatening manner. Daniels said, "The next thing I know, I was on the bed." She described their relationship in a 2018 interview with Anderson Cooper for 60 Minutes.
So he definitely wanted to continue to see you?
Oh, for sure. Yes. And this was not a secret. He never asked me not to tell anyone. He called several times when I was in front of many people, and I'd be like, oh my God, he's calling. And people like, shut up. The Donald?
During her testimony, Trump nudged his attorney repeatedly, who objected to questions and answers when Daniels suggested she didn't want to be alone with Trump again. The judge agreed and struck several of her answers from the record. When the Access Hollywood tape came out before the 2016 election, Daniels said she spoke with her publicist about selling her story.
Suddenly people are reaching out to me again, offering me money, large amounts of money.
She soon learned Trump and his ex-attorney Michael Cohen were interested in paying for her story in a $130,000 deal that came with a non-disclosure agreement. Daniels testified how she wanted the deal done before the election because she was worried I wouldn't be safe or that he wouldn't pay and there would be a trail to keep me safe. Prosecutors then turned to Daniels' 2018 statement denying a sexual affair with Trump ahead of a Wall Street Journal article that was going to outline their deal. Daniels said she did not want to sign it because it was false. The day it was released, she was interviewed by Jimmy Kimmel and denied it was her signature.
Did you sign this letter that was released today?
I don't know, did I?
Wait a minute, that you can say,
that does
right?
not look like my signature, does it?
It doesn't.
Daniels testified she purposely signed her name in a different way to tip off Kimmel. After a court break, Trump's team moved for a mistrial, pointing to aspects of Daniels' testimony. Trump attorney Todd Blanche argued this is the kind of testimony that makes it impossible to come back from. Judge Duane St ruled against the call for a mistrial. Then Trump's team took their turn to question Daniels. Trump's attorney Susan Neckles asked Daniels, "Am I correct that you hate President Trump?" "Yes," Daniels responded. Kara Scannell, CNN, New York.
Our thanks to Kara Scannell for that report. Joining me now to discuss this is Deanna Paul, a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal, Jeremy Saland, a former prosecutor, Joe Patrice, a senior editor for Above the Law, and CNN producer Lauren Del Valle, who was inside the courtroom today witnessing all of the action. So, Lauren, let's start with you. I mean, from the outside, it seemed pretty wild. So what was it like on the inside?
Yeah, you know, as we just heard, we've heard Stormy Daniels' story several times before, but now this is her telling her account of what Donald Trump denies in front of Donald Trump. And she was very casual at times, telling the jury in this almost gossipy tone. And you could see as the testimony went on in such vivid detail from Daniels that Trump was shaking his head. And now just receiving the transcripts, we actually found out that he was audibly cursing, and the judge warned his attorneys that he needed to rein it in because the jury might hear them.
Speaking of the jury, Lauren, what was your perception of how they were taking all of this in? Just for the purpose of those watching us, I mean, the judge himself did not seem super happy with how this was going. Stormy Daniels, as you just said, had this almost gossipy, like she was whispering to her girlfriends about something that happened kind of demeanor. She was talking really fast at certain points. The prosecutor had to ask her to slow down. So the jury is sitting there while all of this is happening. What did you see or observe that they were doing?
So, you know, from my vantage point, I couldn't see them a ton, but we do know they've been engaged this whole time. They've watched, you know, when we've seen the records come in and, you know, today, the more salacious details that Stormy shared with them. They were taking notes today, you know, flipping their pages, feverishly writing page after page. And it's hard to say how they took it in, but yes, Daniels spoke very quickly. The judge and the prosecutor had to ask her to slow down for the court reporter. It was a lot for everyone to take in.
Jeremy, I do want to ask you, just from a legal perspective, this seemed kind of like, I get the argument that they had to do it, but there was some risk involved here. How do you think that this all played at the end of the day?
Well, let's separate, for example, what we're hearing now about Harvey Weinstein and all these bad actors who came in and prejudiced the case because it was too much and beyond the scope of what was before that jury. So this is not one and the same. She is a regular person who clearly was anxious and nervous, at least at first. She's speaking quickly. She's anxious, just like we heard Hope Hicks crying and being distraught at times or upset at times and had to take a break. So I think ultimately they got what they needed out, which is what this is all about, that foundational question. But keep in mind, and this is so important, that her testimony is, I wouldn't say a sideshow because it isn't, but it's not about falsifying business records. It's not about the actual falsification or the election purported crime that's trying to be concealed, if true. She is sort of the foundation as to why this all happened. And you have to protect it from being too salacious, but I do think the judge was correct to say this is not a mistrial. I can correct this in jury instructions. And you know what, frankly, you guys should object more, and you should object early and often.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting that they didn't. You could argue that they were sleeping on the job, but it's almost like maybe they were unsure of exactly where this was all going. Deanna, I do want to kind of zero in on one point that was a big deal, actually, in Stormy's testimony, and this is when she talks about that Wall Street Journal article that she said really changed everything for her. How do you think she came across as a credible witness when I think that really got to the heart of the personal impact that this had on her and how it was so different from what she thought was going to happen when she was trying to ultimately sell her story to someone to lock it up in a vault so that nobody ever heard about it?
So Abby, I think her testimony came across in a number of different ways, and it's really we're going to see how the jury thinks at the end of the day. But in terms of credibility, I wasn't in the courtroom, but on direct examination, what I've heard is that, you know, she was speaking really quickly at the beginning. The judge instructed her to speak slower, so did the prosecution. And on defense, she went from giving really long answers and on defense giving one-word answers and not really going into much detail on cross-examination. And when it comes to deliberation, a jury is going to have to decide whether or not that makes her a credible witness.
Lauren, do you have any insights into that? How did her credibility come across in the room?
You know, it's hard to say. You have somebody who is giving these details down to what the floor looked like and how heavy the furniture was in Donald Trump's hotel room, to varying stories about her motivations as the years went on, and whether she was going to sell her story or put it out there in a press conference for free, as she said. She made a point of saying when she eventually did an interview on 60 Minutes with Anderson that was for free. She was paid zero. But at the same time, other times she was looking to get paid thousands and ended up being paid $130,000 for her story. It's hard to say how the jury will take that. We definitely saw a shift in her tone from when she was free to give the answer she wanted to on direct, to Susan Neckles really giving a tough cross, trying to get her on her motivations and show that money was really driving her.
I mean, Joe, do you think that Susan Neckles scored some points there as she tried to kind of to zero in on the motivations, the financial motivations, the idea she argues that Stormy Daniels has been making money off of this story for what she says is a decade. Did they score any points on that front?
It really depends on how credible Stormy came across, the same question that we've all kind of been talking about here. I actually thought Stormy's answers were pretty good there, as opposed to trying to be obstructionist and deny and say, no, I haven't made money. She said, yeah, I made money and I lost some money too. I owe Trump legal fees because of how this all turned out. She wouldn't deny, which is if she tried to deny, I'm sure Susan Neckles is a very competent attorney. She was ready with receipts to try and say that's not true. But Stormy didn't take that. She was like, yeah, I did make some money, but I also lost. And if that came across credibly, I think that would be, then Neckles did not score points if that's how the jury perceived it.
Joe, do you have a sense of why the Trump team was so slow to object more to this testimony, and then they go all the way and say, okay, we want a mistrial because we think it's too prejudicial?
I don't. Honestly, I'm flummoxed. I would have thought they would have objected more. That would seem to be the proper move. I guess they must have thought that they had enough to get away with making a motion for mistrial, either that they thought they could win it or at least preserve it on appeal with what they had. But no, and I think it opened up the situation for Mershon to respond and say, well, no, I mean, if you wanted to object more, but I can handle this and I can police any damage that happened here through jury instructions.
Do you actually believe, Jeremy, that is true? I think the argument that the defense kind of makes is that realistically, you cannot unring a bell for the jury. They've heard what they've heard.
Very true, but there's a big caveat here. You still have a job as an attorney, and that job is obviously to defend your client within the four corners of the law, ethically, responsibly. They should have said something. Listen, they're good at not saying a peep when Donald Trump is outside that courtroom running his mouth and saying things that are blasphemous, if that's the proper term, about the criminal justice system. Inside the courtroom, as I've said repeatedly, innocent until if and when proven guilty. But they should have absolutely unequivocally, without hesitation, said something and done something. You don't use a benchmark and say, you know what, I probably have done enough, or maybe I've done enough. You need to object vigorously. And not only that, I think just to one of the things you referenced before about Stormy Daniels, the prosecution, from what I'm reading, and I wasn't there as well, did a good job humanizing her as someone who grew up with a single mother, who was a bright woman in school, who was an equestrian. I mean, they did a good job, and she wasn't evasive from what I'm seeing and reading, and I think that's difficult because the defense also does not want to make themselves the center of attention and make the jury not like them. So it's a difficult thing, but they should have been objecting.
All right, everyone. Stand by for us. Coming up next, we'll have a lot more from Stormy Daniels' dramatic day of testimony and the new information the prosecution could end up using to prove their case against Donald Trump. Earlier today, Judge Mershon denied a motion for a mistrial after Trump's defense team argued that Stormy Daniels' testimony went too far. The judge did issue some language to limit some of her testimony. Our panel is back with us. Deanna, that was a really notable thing in the testimony today. I don't think we've seen Judge Mershon react this way to a witness before. I think he almost seemed like turned off, frankly. I mean, look, it's a very salacious subject matter. maybe it was his demeanor, but what does that portend for the prosecution, that they kind of have put the judge in a position where he's not so pleased with their choices here, or perhaps their inability to properly corral one of their witnesses?
Look, I think that the mistrial motion in this case is one of the least surprising things that we've seen yet. Some of the testimony that they elicited on direct examination about an imbalance of power, about consent, about a second sexual advance, Susan Nichols, before she took the stand, they said to the judge, we want to limit the testimony, we object to this line of questioning. And so the prosecution knew that they were going to take issue with it. The judge said, keep your witness within the guardrails that we've already presented, and the prosecution didn't do that.
Yeah, they didn't. I mean, Jeremy, I wonder also about this idea that Stormy, the argument that the defense was making was that Stormy had basically changed her argument or changed how she described the interaction with Trump, perhaps trying to introduce new ideas like whether there was consent involved, about, just other dynamics that weren't present in the initial telling of this. Ultimately, is it fair for them to question whether that kind of testimony was really salient to this particular case, which is ultimately about whether Trump falsified business records?
Well, it's fair to even ask whether or not she should have been testifying in the first place. Now, that'll be very clear. That's a leap. I'm not saying she shouldn't have been, but the point you just made is that this is a falsifying business records case. Whether or not it was consensual or not, or whether they had sex 1 time or 4 times, is arguably, if not at all, is somewhat irrelevant. It only helps establish sort of the motive behind this, which is not something, motive is not something prosecutors have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But, I think the judge was right to say, I'm unhappy. And as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, I'm trying to corral that witness and say, stick to the 4 corners of what I told you to say, not in terms of the words I told you to use, but the truth. Don't veer off, because you're going to subject yourself to challenges for your credibility and cross-examination. So I think the prosecution, afterwards, did a much better job of making it much tighter and much cleaner.
And Joe, I wonder about, I think it was you that brought up the Weinstein case, but correct me if I'm wrong. But that really looms large over so much of these proceedings, because when you're dealing with a really high-profile defendant and someone for whom there is actually a lot of prejudicial information out there that may or may not be relevant to the case, it really raises the question if on appeal all of this stuff can come back up. And the thing about Stormy Daniels' testimony is that this is her story and she's entitled to it, but the degree to which she did introduce information that was not necessarily relevant here, it's got to worry prosecutors to a degree that maybe it was too far. I mean, in some cases she answered questions well beyond the scope of the question that was actually asked of her.
Yeah, the Weinstein case, we just had the New York's highest court overturn that conviction on the argument that introducing, testimony about his abusive nature was, too prejudicial and therefore warranted an abuse of discretion on the part of the judge. That's a case that was about a rape, that actually seems somewhat relevant, his abusive nature. We're talking now about a business records case. These issues now, do seem like something that you could argue a jury is going to be much more prejudiced by, more so than they are, probative is the word we use. They're more prejudiced than they're actually learning about the real nature of the case with this.
Yeah. So, Lauren, one of the other interesting things that happened today outside of court, before the proceedings even started, was that we learned more or less that Stormy was going to be testifying because Donald Trump started tweeting about it. He started tweeting about a witness that he knew was coming and complaining that his attorneys hadn't gotten proper notice about who that person was. Ultimately, that tweet was deleted. But this raises this very question that really came before the court at the beginning, which is that prosecutors were saying, we don't want to tell Trump's lawyers who these witnesses are too far in advance, because Trump is going to do exactly what he did this morning. How do you think that this is going to affect the case? And ultimately, given the gag order proceedings that we had yesterday, is Trump playing with fire here, even by deleting tweeting something, or I should say truth socialing something, and then deleting it later?
Yeah, so I would say today he really towed the line. He did not say her name. We thought maybe she might be the next witness logically in the prosecution's case, but he towed the line by not mentioning her and then deletes it. It wasn't mentioned by prosecutors today, who have been not shy about filing motions to hold him in contempt. And as far as the case going forward, Judge Merchan has said more than once, it is not convenient for anyone to put Trump in jail. And he also understands the gravity of putting a former president and someone running again in jail while he's actively on trial. So, if he continues to push that boundary, we'll have to see what the prosecutors ask for and how Merchan handles that. But I think it's almost hour to hour, as Trump is very close to his phone at all times.
On balance, Deanna, do you think that this was the right call for prosecutors to make, to ultimately put Stormy on the witness stand? It almost seems to me like they certainly could have decided to not do that. We don't necessarily need to substantiate the affair. It doesn't matter, actually, whether the affair happened or not. So was it the right call for them to do this?
And that's exactly right, Abby. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether or not the affair happened. Jurors are probably going to want to hear from Stormy Daniels, and so I think that definitely played into whether or not the prosecution called her. But given what happened today, I do think that there are ripe grounds for appeal, as Joe was saying, in light of the Weinstein decision. And so I don't know if it was the right decision at the end of the day.
Jeremy, I'm gonna say the elephant in the room. This case is complicated. This case is really, really tricky, and it almost felt today like you saw how tricky it's going to be for prosecutors to land this plane. How do you think it's going for them so far?
I think today everyone raised the right point. Is there now an appellate issue? I'm not convinced that there is, but it certainly raised the issue, and now there's a question. Overall, I believe the prosecution is doing their job to lay it brick by brick for the main event, which we know who that is, that's Michael Cohen, to connect all those dots. Because right now, you don't have a hand on that, on that check, writing that check, specifically knowing that it was for this cover-up that might affect an intent to impact the election. But brick by brick, I think they're laying it. And so far, the defense has worked with what they have in terms of cross-examination. It hasn't been that much, but they're still, are they there yet? I don't know. I don't know if they're there yet, but they're working their way towards that proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but they're not there yet.
Yeah, there's still actually quite a lot more, especially on the key part, which is the business records part. We still need to understand better what kind of proof they have, evidence they have of Donald Trump's direct involvement in the falsification part of it all. Everyone, I have a feeling we'll be talking about this with you quite a few more times between now and the end of this case. Thank you very much for joining us.